In the spring of 1852, California's gold country had one name on its lips: Joaquin. The bandit Joaquin Murrieta and his gang of cutthroats had been marauding the countryside for a solid year. In that time, they had collected tens of thousands of dollars worth of gold and horses, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. What's more, it was rumored that many of the people who had found themselves dispatched by Joaquin were not simply collateral damage from the armed robberies. Many whispered that Joaquin knew the men that he had killed, even when they did not recognize him. He wasn't just robbing, he was hunting. But recognizing Joaquin Murrieta was no easy thing. The bandit prided himself on being a master of disguise. His first biographer, John Yellowbird Rolandridge, explained that while pillaging mining camps and robbing the highways, quote, he had worn different disguises and was actually disguised the most when he showed his real features. No man who'd met him on the highway would be apt to recognize him in the cities. He frequently stood very unconcernedly in a crowd and listened to long and earnest conversations in relation to himself, and laughed in his sleeve at the many conjectures that were made as to his whereabouts and intentions. End quote. The most famous bandit in California was also a mystery. He could move undetected through busy towns and quietly laugh to himself as people gossiped about his latest exploits. By 1852, this kind of anonymity was essential if Joaquin Murrieta was going to stay alive. By this point, there was a bounty on his head, and many men were keen to collect it. But we're told that the fearless Joaquin scoffed at this. Rolandridge tells us that the first time Murrieta came across a poster advertising a $5,000 bounty, he grabbed a pencil and wrote underneath it, quote, "I will give 10,000, end quote, and signed it Joaquin. This was Murrieta's style. Or, at least, this was the mythical Murrieta's style. He could blend into a crowd or disappear into the shadows, but he still had a bit of an ego. He couldn't help but pop his head out every now and then, just to showboat a little. He wasn't above scribbling some graffiti on a wanted sign, just so people knew how seriously he took any potential bounty hunters. It let everyone know that he had walked right through town, and they'd all been none the wiser. Of course, it would have been more prudent to walk past the poster unfazed instead of choosing to stop and risk being spotted as he mocked his own bounty. But I suppose, what's the point of being a legend if you can't act legendary from time to time? Joaquin was clearly in one of those moods when, in the spring of 1852, he found himself in a bustling town in Calaveras County, California. We're told that Joaquin disguised himself in a bespoke suit and played the part of a, quote, elegant and successful gambler, end quote. He headed to a saloon to place a few bets at the Monte table. He hadn't been in the establishment for long before he heard someone mention his name. He looked up and saw 4 Anglo-American men loudly bantering about the bandit king, Joaquin Murrieta. These men were talking tough. Each of them bragged that this Mexican outlaw would be no match for them if they were ever to meet. According to John Rolandridge, one of the men loudly declared, quote, that he would like just once in his life to come across Joaquin, and that he would kill him as quick as he would kill a snake, end quote. Now, the smart thing for Joaquin to do in that moment would have been to laugh into his sleeve, as he'd done so many times before. But on this night, he was in a different sort of mood. After hearing this idle threat, we're told that Joaquin jumped up on the Monte table, threw open his cloak, brandished his 6-shooter, and declared, quote, I am Joaquin. If there is any shooting to do, I am in. End quote. The crowd was stunned. The tough-talking Americans froze, not daring to take their presumably longed-for opportunity to kill Joaquin as quick as a snake. Then Joaquin jumped from the table and made a quick exit. Quote, mounting his horse, he dashed off with his party at his heels, sending back a whoop of defiance, which rung out thrillingly in the night air. End quote. Now, even though there really isn't much to that story, this little episode has gone down as the definitive Joaquin Murrieta moment. None of Joaquin's alleged robberies, shootouts, murders, or acts of righteous vengeance have been as well remembered as this colorful moment atop the Monty table. This may be because this episode was transformed into an iconic Zorro moment. The 1920 silent film, The Mark of Zorro, begins in a California saloon, much like the one described by John Rollins. In it, a crowd discusses the exploits of the bandit Zorro, and one man even displays the letter Z that has been carved into his face. This inspires the drunken and buffoonish Mexican Army Sergeant Gonzalez to start bragging about how he would slice this Zorro to ribbons should he ever appear. Listening to all of this and laughing along is the pampered playboy Don Diego de la Vega, a.k.a. Zorro. Don Diego then takes his leave, as the drunken Gonzalez continues abusing the patrons in hopes of baiting Zorro, a known protector of the oppressed. Just then, shrouded in a puff of smoke from his lit cigarette, Zorro appears. He draws his sword and smilingly says, quote, keep your sword, Gonzalez. You will have use for it. End quote. In that defiant challenge, I think you can hear the echo of, I am Joaquin. If there's shooting to do, I am in. Now, I pulled that quote from the earliest known version of the Murrieta story, but you can find a few different wordings of this iconic declaration. I've seen it written as, I am Joaquin, I dare you to shoot, and I am Joaquin, no man takes me alive. But to be honest, I like John Rollins' version the best. There's something so 19th century about I am Joaquin. If there's any shooting to do, I'm in. But it would be the first part of that declaration, I am Joaquin, that would become an immortal catchphrase. The writers of the Mexican folk ballads, known as corridos, would use that phrase as a defiant chorus in their musical retellings of the Joaquin Murrieta myth. For many Mexicans and other Latin Americans, the name Joaquin would carry a similar connotation to Stagger Lee in African American communities. Stagger Lee was mythologized as the baddest of the bad, a dangerous man who is not to be trifled with. Joaquin had the same cachet. The question of whether or not Joaquin Murrieta was a Robin Hood figure was usually irrelevant when the phrase was invoked. I am Joaquin means I'm not to be messed with. Don't think you can talk smack while I'm in earshot. I am Joaquin. Even though it would be wiser to hide right now, my pride won't let me do it. I am Joaquin. It's no surprise that Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez gravitated towards this phrase and made it the refrain and title of his epic poem celebrating Chicano identity. But did Joaquin Murrieta ever actually say these words in that defiant context? The only evidence for it comes from that highly fictionalized biography written by John Rollins. But as Borderlands cultural critic Jose Manuel Valenzuela reminds us, quote, myth is not validated in historical truth, but in its social functionality, end quote. Is it just me? Or is that an academic way of saying just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real? There's no denying the power of the Joaquin myth, but is there any historical truth to be found in the Murrieta story? Let's see what we can discover today on Our Fake History. Episode number 191, Who Was the Real Zorro? Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I want to remind everyone listening that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Start supporting at $5 every month, and you will get access to an ad-free feed and a buttload of patrons-only extra episodes. Speaking of which, the voting has now officially closed for the topic of the next patrons-only extra episode, and I can now proudly announce that the winner is Merlin the Wizard. He came back. He came from behind. Magically, even. Sorry. So we're going to be doing the next patrons-only episode on Merlin. I'm actually happy that that topic won out. It's something I've wanted to research for a while. So awesome. I'm glad the patrons came through. Now I need to start the process of researching and writing and recording the show. It's going to take me a little while. I will keep you posted on my progress. But you know me, I always come through. So patrons, you have a new extra episode to look forward to in the future. So if you want to get in on that, or if you want to get a great gift for the holidays for an Our Fake History fan, think about becoming a Patreon supporter. Go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and check out the level of support that works for you. And I'd like to remind everyone that I am still making videos over at YouTube. So if you don't have the extra cash to support on Patreon, but you want to support the show in some way, a nice, simple way to support would be to go to YouTube, find the Our Fake History channel that I've got going on over there, and subscribe. That would really help. I appreciate that. And share the videos around. That would be very cool as well. Okay. This week, we are returning to pre-statehood California to explore the legendary life of Joaquin Murrieta. This is part 2 in a 2-part series, so if you haven't heard part 1, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give that a listen now. In that first part, I did my best to trace the development of modern comic book heroes like Batman back to the early action hero Zorro. From there, I introduced the legendary bandit Joaquin Murrieta, the man whose story was one of the more potent inspirations for the dashing Zorro character. I also spent some time setting up the historical context that birthed the Joaquin legend. I did my best to explain the violent and racially charged aftermath of the Mexican-American War, and the large-scale dispossession experienced by many former Mexicans living in the territory ceded to the United States. From there, we looked at the origin story of Joaquin Murrieta and the so-called 3 bitter blows that allegedly transformed him from a kind-hearted, idealistic believer in the American dream into a hardened killer bent on revenge. Now, before we get any deeper into the story of Joaquin Murrieta, I should point out that the legendary Joaquin was not the only Latino bandit from California's history whose life story likely inspired Johnston McCulley, the creator of Zorro. So, if we're going to honestly answer the question of who was the real Zorro, then I should take a moment and recognize the other California bandits who clearly contributed to the Zorro mythos. Many have pointed out that a man named Tiburcio Vasquez lived a life that is more reminiscent of the fictional Don Diego de la Vega than even Joaquin Murrieta. Vasquez was a native-born Californio, descended from pre-secession Mexican landowners. Like Don Diego, he was known as a snappy dresser, an elegant dancer, and a consummate ladies' man. The story goes that Vasquez was forced into a life of crime after being wrongfully accused of aiding in a murder. He fled the charges and subsisted on banditry for a number of years. But legend has it that Vasquez would only rob from Anglo-Americans and left alone fellow Californios and Mexican immigrants. Even when he was living outside the law, Vasquez never lost his sense of style and was often spotted wearing a striking black cape. Now, he would go to his grave insisting that throughout his career as a bandit, he never once killed a man. Now, this is disputed, as Vasquez was ultimately convicted of a murder that happened during one of his gang's robberies. But Vasquez always insisted that he was not the man who pulled the trigger. The legend goes that Vasquez was a gentleman bandit who lived by a code. He was eventually captured and was tried in San Jose in 1874, but by that time, he had already become a celebrity among Hispanic Californians. He apparently even autographed pictures of himself from his jail cell for visiting fans to help pay for his legal defense. A play based on his life was mounted and ran in a theater across the street from the courthouse where he was being tried. As far as the famous Zorro actor Douglas Fairbanks was concerned, Tiburcio Vasquez was the real Zorro. Fairbanks was known to recount the much embroidered tale of Vasquez to his guests when they visited his sprawling California estate that he had dubbed Rancho Zorro. But the list of potential real-life Zorros doesn't end with Vasquez. A listener named David from Santa Maria, California, sent me an email telling me the tale of Solomon Pico, a California bandit related to the last Mexican governor of California. This upper-crust bandit apparently worked the hills near Santa Maria before being tracked down by a group of vigilantes and eventually making an escape to Mexico. According to my man David, if you're in Santa Maria, then the real Zorro was always Solomon Pico. The truth is that Zorro was clearly inspired by many different sources, some literary and some historical. But when I was researching this, I got stuck on Joaquin Murrieta because his story is so dense with mythology. The man is a layer cake of fake history. So while Tiburcio Vasquez and Solomon Pico are clearly fascinating figures who likely influenced the author of Zorro, in my humble opinion, it's Murrieta who really needs a more thorough unpacking. So let's get back into it. Now, one of the keys to understanding the myth of Joaquin Murrieta is understanding the man who wrote his first highly fictional biography, John Yellowbird Rolandridge. As I mentioned in the last episode, despite the fact that Yellowbird is considered the first indigenous North American novelist, his reputation among other indigenous folks remains complicated. So, before we get back to the legend of Joaquin, let's get into the legacy of the biographer, John Rolandridge. John Yellowbird Rolandridge was a man who did not neatly fit into any box you might want to construct for him. He was born in Georgia in 1827. His father, also named John Ridge, was a prominent member of the Cherokee Nation, being the son of the famous Cherokee leader Major Ridge. Yellowbird's mother was a European-descended New England Puritan named Sarah Bird Northrop. His parents had met while his father was attending a foreign mission school in Cornwall, Connecticut. So, young John Rolandridge was a product of both Cherokee culture and European New England culture. But as a child, John Rolandridge found himself living at a particularly tumultuous moment for the Cherokee Nation. Yellowbird's grandfather, Major Ridge, was also known as Pathkiller II. And damn, there's a badass nom de guerre if I've ever heard one. Pathkiller had distinguished himself as a storied warrior during the Cherokee-American Wars of the late 18th century. But by the 1830s, Major Ridge had become convinced that despite decades of resistance, the Cherokee were doomed to lose their traditional territory in Georgia. The discovery of gold in the state and the ensuing Georgia gold rush only accelerated this process. Major Ridge believed that the only choice for his people was to cut a deal with the American government, whereby the Cherokee would peacefully relocate to a new territory where their sovereignty was guaranteed. This would hopefully preserve the nation's autonomy and many of the Cherokee's hard-won rights. The result was that Major Ridge and his son John Ridge both became signatories on the highly controversial Treaty of New Echota. This treaty officially ceded the traditional Cherokee territory in Georgia to the United States and relocated the Cherokee to the newly created Indian Territory further west. This made the Cherokee the last of the so-called 5 civilized tribes to be brought in on this relocation scheme. But the mass relocation to the Indian Territory has gone down as one of the great tragedies of Indigenous history, as thousands died of disease and hunger on the march westward. This deadly relocation has been remembered as the Trail of Tears. The controversy over the signing of the Treaty of New Echota split the Cherokee into opposing factions. Many believed that Major Ridge and his family had betrayed the Cherokee by signing this treaty and had doomed the nation to the Trail of Tears. For some Cherokee, the once celebrated Ridge family were now thought of as vile turncoats who had sold out their nation. This factional dispute came to a bloody climax in 1839 when Yellowbird's father, John Ridge, and his grandfather, Major Ridge, were both assassinated by other Cherokee who blamed the family for the disastrous relocation. John Yellowbird Rolandridge was 12 at the time. As you might imagine, this traumatic event complicated John Rolandridge's relationship with his Cherokee heritage. Being the son of John Ridge meant that he was not accepted among many members of his nation. His writing reflects his conflicted feelings about being Cherokee. At some points in his life, Rolandridge sought to distance himself from the Cherokee Nation, while at other points in his life, he embraced his indigenous roots and celebrated everything that was Cherokee. With that in mind, we should be cautious when jumping to conclusions about how being Cherokee affected John Rolandridge's approach to the Joaquin Murrieta story. The lazy take is that because Ridge was Cherokee, he empathized with the plight of Mexicans during the California Gold Rush. Perhaps he even saw a parallel between the dispossession of native-born Californios and his own Cherokee people. Literary scholar Carl Kroeber once wrote, quote, Californians' treatment of Mexicans parallels the Georgians' treatment of the Cherokee, whose expulsion was in part precipitated by the discovery of gold in their territory. End quote. Now, that interpretation would seem obvious, but it's complicated given the Ridge family's specific place in the history of Cherokee relocation. John Roland Ridge's writing doesn't really emphasize a common struggle between oppressed people. On the contrary, his book on Joaquin Murrieta reflects many of the racial prejudices common in the 1850s. Throughout his book, he emphasizes Joaquin Murrieta's whiteness and spends long passages explaining the Castilian pedigree of his lover Rosita. The idea being that the outrages against them are made all the worse because they were basically white people. He makes a point of saying that Joaquin Murrieta's attackers were especially evil because they acted out of character for members of the, quote, vaunted Anglo-Saxon race, end quote. Ridge is perhaps at his most prejudiced when it comes to Chinese immigrants, who he writes about with an almost palpable sense of contempt. Now, it's hard to say whether or not these passages reflect Roland Ridge's personal attitudes or if they were included to better reflect the presumed attitudes of his Anglo-American readers. The book is clearly sympathetic to Joaquin Murrieta, but it's debatable how sympathetic it is to Mexican people in general. James Perrins, who was an expert on Cherokee history and wrote one of the best biographies on John Yellowbird Roland Ridge, argues that Ridge's interest in Joaquin Murrieta likely had more to do with the similarities between their two life stories, rather than any larger sympathies for Mexicans in America. Perrins writes, quote, Joaquin himself must have fascinated Ridge. Here was a man who tried to live peacefully despite wrongs inflicted on his family and friends. Joaquin's only crime at first was that he did not belong to the faction in power. Driven over the brink by his enemies, he had to react violently. This action forced him into exile, where his intelligence and courage let him revenge himself on his persecutors. He was admired by his own people and feared by his enemies. In many ways, Joaquin's early history was much like that of the writer who would immortalize him. His later career had to appeal to Ridge's deep thirst for revenge. End quote. I think Perrins has the best take on this. If you go into John Roland Ridge's work expecting to find a before-his-time progressive brimming with Cherokee pride, you will quickly be disabused of that. Ridge's attraction to the Murrieta legend was likely a very personal thing. So, with all that said, let's now turn our attention back to the Murrieta legend. When we last left Joaquin Murrieta, he had just sustained the infamous bitter blows that would forever alter his life. He had been beaten, chased from the gold country, his wife had been violated, and his half-brother, or a friend, or a full brother, had been lynched in front of him. Ridge identifies the man as his half-brother, and writes that as Murrieta buried his family member, quote, he swore an oath of the most awful solemnity, that his soul should never know peace until his hands were dyed deep in the blood of his enemies, end quote. Given the drama of those lines, I was a little surprised at just how briskly John Roland Ridge moves through the story of Joaquin's revenge. The tale of Joaquin's righteous vengeance barely takes up one whole page in the book. But I will say, this is one of the things that helps the book appear more historically accurate. In this case, it's clear that John Rolandridge found few details about this particular time in Joaquin's life. So he simply reports what he knows, or at least what was rumored. After the death of Joaquin's brother, Ridge writes, quote, "It was not long before an American was found dead in the vicinity of Murphy's diggings, having been almost literally cut to pieces with a knife. Although horribly mangled, he was recognized as one of the mob engaged in the whipping of Joaquin and the hanging of his brother." End quote. Now that's all he writes about Joaquin's potential first kill. This lack of detail was clearly unsatisfactory for a number of later dime store authors who went on to pen gory imaginings of this first knife attack. These novels from the late 1800s tended to be less sympathetic to Joaquin, more sensationalist in nature, and more informed by negative stereotypes about Mexican people. By comparison, John Rolandridge's account comes across as, dare I say, tasteful? As for the rest of Joaquin's revenge against the mob who killed his brother, Rolandridge sums it up like this, quote, "A panic spread among the rash individuals who had composed that mob. They were afraid to stir out on their ordinary business. Whenever any one of them strayed out of sight of his camp or ventured to travel on the highway, he was shot down suddenly and mysteriously. Report after report came into the villages that Americans had been found dead on the highways, having been either shot or stabbed, and it was invariably discovered for many weeks that the murdered men belonged to the mob who had outraged Joaquin." End quote. To emphasize just how thorough Joaquin was in killing every last man involved in the death of his brother, Rolandridge includes a quote from a man he claimed was an eyewitness to some of these killings. This gentleman apparently told the author, quote, "I am inclined to think that Joaquin wiped out most of those prominently engaged in whipping him." End quote. And that's basically all we get when it comes to Joaquin's revenge. A quick description of some bodies found on the highway and one old-timer going, "Yep, pretty sure he killed them all." But in the scope of Rolandridge's novel, Joaquin's revenge isn't really the point. Instead, it simply serves to explain why he pursued a life of banditry. After committing at least a dozen murders, Joaquin had essentially made himself unemployable. He was a wanted man. He had chosen a life outside the law, and from then on in, he was going to have to steal for a living. According to Rolandridge, Joaquin spent the next year robbing miners on the road and rustling horses. In the process, he steadily distinguished himself as a leader. Rolandridge tells us, quote, "His superior intelligence and education gave him the respect of his comrades, and appealing to the prejudice against the Yankees, he soon assembled around him a powerful band of his countrymen." End quote. Now, this is the part of the story that really starts to resemble the Robin Hood legend, because here Joaquin starts to assemble his band of merry men. We're told that his gang will eventually include dozens of disaffected Mexicans, many from his home state of Sonora. But the men in the inner circle are named as Reyes Feliz, Joaquin Valenzuela, Pedro Gonzalez, and Claudio. Like the merry men, each of these fellows has their own specialty. One man's good with a knife, one is handy with a rope, another is a crack shot. But of all his compatriots, the most famous was undoubtedly Manuel Garcia, better known as Three-Fingered Jack. Of all the men named by Rolandridge, Garcia is the one we are most sure actually existed. There are multiple contemporary newspaper sources about the exploits of Three-Fingered Jack. Roland Ridge tells us that Manuel Garcia got his memorable nickname during the Mexican-American War when he was fighting in the Mexican army. Apparently, one of his fingers was blown off during a skirmish with the Americans. So, on one hand, he technically had 3 fingers and a thumb. But, three-finger Jack just has a better ring to it. Anyway, in Roland Ridge's novel, Three-Finger Jack is presented as a sadistic monster. Any of the murderous excesses committed by Joaquin's gang, Roland Ridge tells us were the doing of Three-Finger Jack. Roland Ridge's description of Manuel Garcia also hurts the interpretation that the author was especially sympathetic towards Mexicans. He presents Joaquin Murrieta as an essentially good person who was pushed to a life of revenge and banditry. But when describing other Mexican bandits, Roland Ridge often indulges in harmful stereotypes about Mexican people being especially violent. His descriptions of Three-Finger Jack are key examples of this. He writes of Garcia, quote, "He was different from his more youthful leader, in possessing nothing of his generous, frank, and cordial disposition, and in being utterly destitute of one merciful trait of humanity. He delighted in murder for its own diabolical sake, and he gloated over the agonies of his unoffending victims. He would sacrifice policy, the safety and interests of the band, for the mere gratification of his murderous propensity, and it required all Joaquin's firmness and determination to hold him in check." End quote. Where Roland Ridge often tempers his descriptions of Joaquin's more violent moments, he indulges in some very gory prose when describing the crimes of Three-Finger Jack. I'll give you an example. And if you don't want to hear something explicitly violent, then please skip like 15 to 20 seconds. When introducing Three-Finger Jack, the author takes a moment to describe exactly what he did to a pair of American miners he robbed before linking up with Joaquin. After robbing the men, he, quote, "stripped them entirely naked and, binding them each to a tree, slowly tortured them to death. He began by throwing knives at their bodies as if he were practicing at a target. He then cut out their tongues, punched out their eyes with his knife, gashed their bodies in numerous places, and finally, flaying them alive, left them to die." End quote. So, in this telling, Three-Finger Jack is like, what if Little John was a bloodthirsty psychopath? Once the gang is assembled, the rest of Roland Ridge's novel becomes very episodic in nature. The book doesn't really follow a conventional story arc. Roland Ridge recounts some of the crimes that were attributed to Joaquin in the papers, and dramatizes many of the rumors about Joaquin that were floating around California at that time. Most of the episodes involve the crew robbing miners that they catch on the road. The post-Roland Ridge legend would have us believe that Joaquin only robbed Anglo-Americans and left Mexicans and indigenous folks alone. However, this is perhaps one of the biggest myths about Joaquin Murrieta. If we use the newspaper reports as a guide, it seems like Joaquin was an equal opportunity thief who robbed from anyone. Now, to be clear, it's hard to know this for certain, as the newspaper reports were often biased and inaccurate. As I mentioned in part 1, many of the crimes attributed by the papers to a bandit called Joaquin may not have been carried out by Joaquin Murrieta. But it's worth saying that those reports do not suggest that his gang exclusively robbed Anglos. Mexicans were among his victims. Newspapers also suggest that as many as 28 Chinese miners were robbed and killed by Joaquin's gang. Indeed, Roland Ridge includes a scene where Joaquin begrudgingly allows Three-Finger Jack to kill a group of Chinese miners to slake his thirst for blood. So, even in this text, which in many ways enshrines the myth of Joaquin Murrieta, the gang doesn't always come off as virtuous defenders of the oppressed. They weren't always punching up, if you know what I mean. One of the best-known crimes that was associated with Joaquin's gang were a group of murders that took place near a town called Marysville, California. Now, of course, Roland Ridge includes a passage about this in his novel, but he's cagey when it comes to pinning it on Joaquin. He writes, quote, "It was not long before the entire country rung with the accounts of frequent, startling, and diabolical murders. 7 men were murdered within 3 or 4 days in a region of country not more than 12 miles in extent. Shortly after the murders thus mentioned, 2 men who were traveling on the road that leads up Feather River discovered just ahead of them 4 Mexicans. One of them was dragging at his saddle bow by a lariat, an American whom they had just lassoed around the neck." End quote. Now, what's interesting here is that Roland Ridge doesn't explicitly say that these Mexicans were Joaquin and his gang. He just suggests that there's a good possibility that they were. Now, in later retellings, this nuance would disappear. For all his myth-making, Roland Ridge has moments where he still comes off like a journalist who wants his readers to know what stories have been substantiated. Later dime store novels would remove this ambiguity. Anything that could be laid at Joaquin's feet often was. But by the same token, Roland Ridge seems happy to set aside his journalistic scruples when it comes to recounting a story that's especially fun. And indeed, the life and adventures of Joaquin Murrieta really comes alive when the author is giving you a detailed description of some wild story of Joaquin's daring do. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, let's indulge in some of those tales. Many of the most memorable moments from the life and adventures of Joaquin Murrieta often reinforce a few basic ideas about the outlaw. First, he had a certain moral code. He avoided violence when he could. He rewarded those who were loyal and punished those who betrayed him. Second, he was fearless and delighted in taking daring risks. Finally, he was a master of disguise. He spoke English fluently without a noticeable Spanish accent and could easily pass as an Anglo. This opens up the question of what Joaquin Murrieta actually looked like. Most drawings of the outlaw depict him as a swarthy, thinly mustachioed fellow with flowing dark hair that fell below his shoulders. Some reports claim that he had black hair and black eyes. Other reports claim that he had fair hair and blue eyes. Not to jump too far ahead, but the remains of the man alleged to be Joaquin Murrieta were described by one source as having blue eyes and a hair with a, quote, golden tint, end quote. John Roland Ridge's descriptions are somewhat inconsistent throughout the novel. But he does mention that Joaquin was able to disguise himself as a, quote, red-headed stranger, end quote, which Just makes me think of Willie Nelson. Interestingly, historian Shelley Strebe has pointed out that in the various fictionalized versions of Joaquin's life, the more sympathetic texts tend to describe him as having light skin, lighter hair, and blue or green eyes. In other words, more white. The texts that portray him as a violent thug tend to describe him as having darker skin, hair, and eyes. Joaquin's look would change depending on how the author wanted the audience to feel about him. Now, Roland Ridge is hard to pin down on this. Sometimes he describes Joaquin as having long, flowing black hair, while at other times, Joaquin can pass as a red-headed stranger, which suggests that maybe he had a collection of wigs? But now I'm just guessing, because Roland Ridge is not very clear on this point. Either way, Joaquin's ability to disguise himself would play into a number of the most dramatic moments in the book. For instance, there's one particular episode where we're told that Joaquin encountered an old friend named Joe Lake. Lake had known Joaquin back in his gold mining days, before he had turned to banditry. Now, this chance meeting was potentially dangerous, as Joaquin fiercely guarded his anonymity. Crossing paths with a man who could positively ID him was not something to be taken lightly. But we're told that Joaquin decided to act magnanimously. Ridge tells us that he embraced his old friend and told him that he wished him no harm. However, he needed Lake to swear that he wouldn't tell anyone that they had crossed paths. Joe Lake made a solemn oath, and Joaquin graciously took him at his word. But turns out that Joe Lake was a snitch. As soon as he had the chance, he headed to the nearest town and told the local authorities that the bandit Joaquin was in the area. But what he didn't know was that Joaquin had ears everywhere. You see, many Mexicans were sympathetic to Joaquin, and one such man caught wind of Joe Lake's treachery and hurried to tell the bandit that he had been betrayed. Now, the wise thing would have been simply to hightail it somewhere far away, but this was Joaquin. He was not about to leave without settling the score. John Roland Ridge writes, quote, "About sundown of the next day, a solitary horseman whose head was covered with a profusion of red hair rode up very leisurely to the front of a trading post at which Lake and some other gentlemen were standing, politely raised his hat, and addressed an inquiry to Lake which caused him to step forward from the crowd to better converse. 'Is your name Lake?' said the red-haired stranger. 'The same,' was the reply. 'Well, sir, I am Joaquin. You have lied to me.' Lake, being unarmed, exclaimed, 'Gentlemen, protect me!' and sprang back towards the crowd. Several persons drew their revolvers, but not before the quick hand of Joaquin had presented his and pulled the trigger. The aim was fatal, and Lake fell in the agonies of death. The murderer wheeled his horse in an instant, and by a sudden bound passed the aim of the revolvers which were discharged at him. In another instant, he was seen on the summit of a hill, surrounded by no less than 50 well-mounted men, with whom he slowly rode off." End quote. I love those stories. In Roland Ridge's novel, Joaquin is always reasonable until he's wronged. Then he's very dangerous. You may also have noticed that before fatally shooting Joe Lake, Joaquin pulls his favorite move, suddenly pulling off his disguise and exclaiming, "I am Joaquin." This episode is quite similar to another memorable exploit that appears a few chapters later in Roland Ridge's book. In this instance, we're told that Joaquin Murrieta was separated from his gang, but despite the fact that he was riding solo, he still felt bold enough to attempt a robbery. he got word that a group of 25 miners who had just managed to mine thousands of dollars worth of gold were camping not far from his location. Joaquin, being Joaquin, felt confident that he could rob all 25 by himself. So he tracked them down and attempted to lull them into a false sense of security by approaching them as a harmless traveler. This time, Ridge describes Joaquin as having dark hair and eyes, but speaking perfect English, so that the miners, quote, could scarcely make out whether he was a Mexican or an American, end quote. He was chatting amiably with the men when one fellow named Jim Boyce came up from the banks of a nearby river and instantly recognized the rogue who was casually chopping it up with his buddies. He yelled out, quote, "Boys, that fellow is Joaquin, damn it! Shoot him!" End quote. With that, Joaquin whirled about on his horse and galloped off. But these miners were determined, and they quickly mounted horses and gave chase, firing their revolvers the whole time. Roland Ridge even tells us that one of the bullets went straight through Joaquin's hat. But unafraid, Joaquin drew his Bowie knife and defiantly yelled out his catchphrase, quote, "I am Joaquin! Kill me if you can!" End quote. The miners were unable to kill him that day, as Joaquin's horse was simply too fast. But the story doesn't end there. Guessing that these miners were now determined to catch him and collect the bounty on his head, Joaquin made a plan. He reconnected with a small group of 15 men from his gang and laid a clever trap for Jim Boyce and the pursuing miners. Joaquin and his crew set out on a ride, and along the way left conspicuous clues about their route for the miners to follow. This included making camps and leaving signs like an extinguished campfire that made it look like the bandits had spent the night. In reality, they had just kept galloping. Sure enough, Jim Boyce and his crew followed this breadcrumb trail exactly as he was supposed to, thinking he was closing in on Joaquin. What he didn't know was that Joaquin and his bandits had circled back behind the miners and were now effectively chasing them. They then waited for the miners to make camp, betting correctly that Jim Boyce and his men would use one of Joaquin's abandoned campsites. Then, under the cover of night, they ambushed the miners as they sat around the fire. Even more terrifyingly, for this attack, Joaquin let three-fingered Jack off his chain. Roland Ridge writes, quote, "Jack leapt in like a demon with his huge knife in his mutilated hand, which had lost none of its strength, but did its three-fingered work far better than many other whole hands could do it, and soon quenched the last spark of beating life in the pale forms around him." End quote. Oof. I can't help but love the phrase three-fingered work. That's good. It's grisly. In the end, 15 men were killed. Jim Boyce and 9 other survivors managed to escape. And the victorious Joaquin found himself $30,000 richer and the proud owner of 15 new horses. Now, are any of these exploits based on fact? Well, in both of the examples I just gave you, we simply do not know. The only known source for these stories is John Roland Ridge. It's likely that he embroidered on an existing oral tradition that was circulating in California. But again, that's just a guess. Now, of course, there are many other stories about Joaquin's exploits in Roland Ridge's novel, and still more in the works of historical fiction that used Roland Ridge as their primary source. But most have the same feel, and the best ones always involve our hero yelling, "I am Joaquin." But how does this story end? Well, as you might remember from part 1, in the spring of 1853, the California state government decided that they needed to take action against banditry in the gold country. Now, it's worth knowing that 1853 was an election year for the governorship of the state. The incumbent governor was a Democrat named John Bigler, whose popularity was slipping. Specifically, the governor needed to shore up support in the mining communities, who would likely make the difference in the next election. To this end, he decided to round up one of the most notorious bandits in the gold country. But, as I mentioned in part 1, exactly who this notorious bandit was somewhat obscure to the members of the California legislature, beyond the fact that his name was probably Joaquin. So they drafted a bill that created the California Rangers, a group of American Army veterans who were empowered to hunt down and, if necessary, kill the 5 Joaquins. These were 5 different bandits, all of whom used the name Joaquin, of which Joaquin Murrieta was just one. The Rangers were to be paid $150 a month, with an added $1,000 bonus if they successfully brought in the wanted men, or man, dead or alive. The leader of the California Rangers was a man named Harry Love, a former U.S. Army captain and a seasoned bounty hunter who a year earlier had killed Pedro Gonzalez. Gonzalez, as you might remember, was one of the men named as a member of Joaquin Murrieta's inner circle. The Rangers hunted for the 5 Joaquins for a solid 2 months before catching up with, well, some group of Mexicans just south of Fresno, California on July 25th, 1853. Love would claim that this small contingent of 8 men was in fact the inner circle of the Joaquin gang, including Joaquin Murrieta and 3-Fingered Jack. In a letter written 3 days later, Harry Love would describe the showdown like this. Quote, Joaquin was immediately recognized, and on being aware of the fact, immediately sprang to his horse and endeavored to escape. He was closely pursued, and his horse shot from under him. When he took flight on foot, and he being wounded, some of the men shot him dead before going far. The remaining part of the band fought bravely while retreating, each of them being armed with 2 6-shooters. 3 of their number were killed, while the remainder escaped, some badly wounded. Immediately after returning from the pursuit, we beheaded Joaquin and one of his principal men, and I dispatched Captain Burns and John Sylvester to Fort Miller with the heads in order to be put in liquor for preservation. End quote. According to Harry Love, that was the end of Joaquin Murrieta. I can't help but be struck by the wild contrast between Love's very matter-of-fact description of this fight and the florid prose that we get in the writing of John Rolandridge. This death feels very anticlimactic, given all the daring acts attributed to the legendary Joaquin. But perhaps that's the difference between myth and reality. The man of myth can dance between the bullets and yell out his catchphrase while hot lead whizzes harmlessly through his hat. The real guy gets his horse shot out beneath him and then is unceremoniously shot in the back as he tries to limp away. In this case, the dissonance between the myth and the reality was so great that it's no surprise that many refused to believe that Joaquin went out like that. So, as Love says at the end of that quote, to prove that they had actually killed Joaquin, the Rangers had him beheaded and then had his head pickled and placed in a jar. The other principal man referred to in Harry Love's letter was likely Three-Fingered Jack, as we know that his mutilated hand was also removed and preserved in alcohol. Harry Love then took these grisly trophies and publicly displayed them in both Stockton, California, and then later in San Francisco. He charged a $1 admittance for any member of the public eager to gaze upon the head of Joaquin. But this apparent proof of Joaquin's death was not accepted by many Californians in 1853. There were many people who publicly challenged the provenance of Harry Love's head in a jar. Many believed that the head being displayed by Harry Love did not in fact belong to Joaquin Murrieta. Part of this had to do with the ever controversial question of what Joaquin actually looked like. The head had a distinctive scar under one eye, which was believed to be one of Joaquin Murrieta's unmistakable identifying features. But despite that, Love's pickled head apparently had blue eyes and, quote, gold-tinged hair, which ran contrary to other reports that said that Joaquin had dark brown eyes and black hair. In fact, the Los Angeles Star, a well-read bilingual newspaper at the time, published an article questioning the provenance of this head. They reported that they had interviewed 3 Sonoran Mexicans who had allegedly been part of the group attacked by Harry Love and his California Rangers. The Los Angeles Star reported that their sources, quote, were attacked by a party of Americans and that the balance of their party, 4 in number, had been killed, that Joaquin Valenzuela was one of them. He was killed as he was endeavoring to escape and that his head was cut off by his captors as a trophy. It is too well known that Joaquin Murrieta is not the person killed by Captain Harry Love's company. The head recently exhibited in Stockton bears no resemblance to that individual, and this is positively asserted by those who have seen the real Murrieta and the spurious head." End quote. So, according to the Los Angeles Star, that pickled head that was being displayed belonged to the wrong Joaquin. Now, if you've been listening close, you might remember that Joaquin Valenzuela was commonly thought to be part of Joaquin Murrieta's gang. John Roland Ridge identifies him as a member of the Inner Circle. Valenzuela was also named by the California State Legislature as one of the 5 Joaquins. So, technically, even if the head belonged to Valenzuela, the Rangers still had captured one of the men that they had been charged with hunting. But others claimed that the head did not belong to any member of the Joaquin gang. Instead, it was rumored that the Rangers had attacked a random group of Mexicans and were now displaying a head collected from some poor guy who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some credence was given to this theory when a few years later, one of Love's former Rangers was interviewed and was quoted as saying, quote, "One pickled head was as good as another if there was a scar on the face and no one knew the difference." End quote. However, in 1853, Harry Love was able to collect an affidavit with the signatures of 17 people, including one priest, who swore that they had known Joaquin Murrieta when he had lived, and that this head being displayed in Stockton was certainly the head of the man they had known in life. This sworn affidavit was good enough evidence for Governor Bigler, who awarded Love and his Rangers their $1,000 bonus, and then used the news of Joaquin's killing to help him win a very tight race for re-election just 11 days later. But the sworn affidavit has never been enough for some people. Joaquin's death seemed just a little too unremarkable for a man who had lived such a remarkable life. So, a tradition emerged that Joaquin Murrieta was not killed by the California Rangers, but instead took the widely believed reports of his death as an opportunity to retire. According to legend, he quietly slipped back over the border and lived the rest of his life in his home state of Sonora, Mexico. Apparently, there still exists a group of people in Mexico who refer to themselves as the descendants of Joaquin Murrieta. The director and Murrieta researcher, John Valadez, did his best to follow up on this claim and journeyed to Sonora, where he met many people with the Murrieta last name. But despite that, he was unable to find a birth certificate, death certificate, or any other piece of physical evidence that could connect these modern Murrietas to the legendary bandit. Whether or not the real Joaquin was killed by Harry Love in 1853, it's clear that the crime wave associated with Joaquin's gang came to an end around the time that pickled head was displayed in Stockton. Questioned about the survival of Murrieta later in life, a noticeably annoyed Harry Love was quoted as saying, quote, "Only people who want to believe that Murrieta is alive doubt he is dead. Let them believe what they could, if it does them any good. But Murrieta is as dead as lead can make him, and he will stay dead until Gabriel blows his horn." End quote. Harry Love may have been adamant that the real Joaquin died in 1853, but he was wrong about one thing. Joaquin Murrieta did not stay dead. He found himself reincarnated again and again in the pages of dime store novels, in the corridos of Mexican balladeers, in the Zorro stories of Johnston McCulley, and in the films of Douglas Fairbanks. After all, it's only a couple steps from "I am Joaquin" to
"I'm Batman."
Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. Before we go this week, I just want to remind everyone that awesome Our Fake History merch with artwork created by the amazing Frank Fiorentino is available at our TeePublic store. Just go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the link to the store. You can get t-shirts, hoodies, tote bags, mugs, all sorts of stuff with Our Fake History art on it. It makes a great gift for the holidays. All right. Before we go this week, of course, I need to give a shout out to a few special people. Big ups to Willie Moeller, to Art, to Nick Crow, to Xander Cook, to Preston, to Don Watts, to David, to Coo Ranch, to Alfredo Nava, to Zoya Knopf, and to Lise Spiral. All of these folks have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone who supports this show at all levels. It means a lot. And, I know I'm always pushing the support thing, but I get it if you're unable to support financially. I completely understand. People sometimes send me messages saying that they're sorry that they can't support. And you don't need to do that. Free podcasts rule. They're the best. That's one of the last great things on the internet. So don't feel bad about that. But if you want to support the show for free, just give us a 5-star review. Or like I said, subscribe on YouTube. That would really help. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. You can find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. Everywhere there's something called Our Fake History, it should be me, except no substitutions. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
I'm Walter Masterson.
And I'm Maximilian Clark.
And we're basically journalists.
No, we're not.
Well, we do travel across America and interview people.
Yeah, using God to solve murders, and it's proven communication.
Tell me everything about that.
But we also dress up like extremists and sneak into their protests.
I care about children. That is why I pay my court-mandated child support.
Well, that's undercover journalism.
Okay, and that time we pretended to be Trump's legal team during the indictment?
Trump loves America. He considers us all family. That's why he's always asking us for money.
Okay, so we are not journalists. We're TikTok comedians asking questions real journalists are too smart to ask.
But we also talk to real experts and scientists and smart people and stuff.
And make fun of them.
Yeah, I guess that's why we named our show We Are Not Journalists.
Because we're better. We have a podcast.
A podcast that's available on whatever podcast app you use to get your podcasts.
Podcast.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.